Today I'm joined by my great friend MJ, who is from Canada but lives over here in the UK in the same county that I live in, Devon. Now, MJ is going to be sharing some tips on how to live courageously. She blogs, she's a fantastic yoga teacher, and she does a lot of mindfulness. But let's talk about Devon first, MJ. So, place I know well, it's got moors, it's got the sea, fresh air. What do you like about living down here?
So Devon, just the things you mentioned, it's close to the sea, and going swimming and being near fresh water is really, really good for well-being. And that's a big part of it. I tried moving back to a city briefly, and I realized that being around fresh country air, being able to just be in places where there's less cars, less people, it's actually really good for the body. So I absolutely love Devon. I do like driving. So even driving around and seeing the beautiful vistas, being able to do the coastal walks. And as you know, being able to go horse riding and certain things like that. It's just a beautiful place to live. Also, it actually reminds me of Canada. So I think I lived in London, I lived in Liverpool, I lived in a place called Shropshire, and I've landed in Devon. It seems I'm not going to get away. Plus, it reminds me of Canada, so I think it's a good place to be.
It's a proper place to be.
It sure is.
So, obviously, it's not going to suit everyone. What can people do to ensure they're in a place that really suits them? How can they sort of be honest with themselves and, make sure it aligns with them?
Gosh, there's so many different things I think people need to take into account. And obviously, that's their livelihood, what they do for a living. For some people, I think different times of their lives, places can be more suitable. When I was younger, living in a city and traveling around and going to different cities and shopping and partying and all that, that felt more suitable. But that lifestyle was exhausting me. And certainly a lot of people that I work with, it does eventually. And so sometimes we don't need to radically alter every part of our lives and up sticks and move somewhere else. But what I do find with clients that work and live in a city is that they manage their lives so that they have regular breaks, even things like going to a park at lunchtime or making sure that at the weekend they're getting out of the city. Because let's face it, most cities will have the countryside just outside of the city limits,
Sure.
right? So getting out into the fresh air, I think, is becoming more and more a priority for people, especially after all this lockdown and people had to really be isolated. We're realizing that the outdoors has so many benefits. So again, it's kind of like feeling it out, knowing that you're looked after, obviously financially and all that kind of stuff, and doing the little tweaks in our day-to-day life that can help us feel better. And then, like some people I've met, including myself, eventually it might come that you do just move to the countryside. And I am seeing that a lot more, where people are deciding to sell up their life in the city and make a move and get cows and sheep and do all that crazy stuff. So
I guess more people can work remotely.
Exactly. That's a big thing, isn't it?
One of the things you've spoken about, or written about, is unplugging. So unplugging, taking something out, but what do you mean by that? And is that something that helps with calming the mind and staying in a sort of peaceful state?
Absolutely. So part of my story is I had these sort of wild, spontaneous spiritual awakenings when I was 19 years old. I know. And part of the insight, and again, I'm very kind of sensitive. I feel things and I intuit things that are going on. And I realized quite quickly that watching the television news and engaging with endless negative news stories was really affecting my state of being.
Okay.
I was impacted, wars and famine affected me so deeply that I just realized, okay, most of that, if not all of it that I'm seeing on the news, I cannot control. In the here now moment, I can't control what's going on in that news story. So I realized that it was valid if I wanted to not engage. It's not that I'm not aware, it's not this idea of burying a head in the sand, but it's effectively managing your state of being and realizing that if you're engaging with information, whether it's on our phones, our televisions, the newspaper, and that information that you're engaging is like making you feel bad or making you feel numb or making you feel depressed, whatever it might be, angry, out of control, right? Any number of things. You have the ability to make a conscious choice to unplug. And that just means to turn it off. And I can honestly say, I have been not watching television, engaging with news stories and that kind of stuff for almost 10 years.
Right.
And I am definitely a happier person for it. And that doesn't mean that I'm not fully aware of all the things that are going on in the world as such. You know, you still get dribs and drabs. I'm on YouTube, I'm on social media, right? And that requires a lot of discernment and discipline. But yeah, I think we're living in a time where our personal responsibility can sort of become a priority to feeling like we have to do all the things that everybody else is doing.
Just to pick up on a nice phrase you used there, so to bury one's head in the sand means to, if you imagine it sort of visually, you're putting your head under the sand so that you're not aware of what's going on. You're kind of insulating yourself.
I pretend like nothing's going on.
Moving on to something you're an expert in, yoga. What would you say the benefits of practicing yoga are? Oh my gosh, Benjamin, this question, my goodness. So I have been practicing yoga for most of my life. My mother, I was in a professional children's dance company from quite a young age, and I had a lot of pressure. I was one of these kids that just seemed to put like a lot of pressure on themselves, and I would be doing my dancing like this. Do you see my shoulders? My mom got me in to see a chiropractor, which helped me soften my shoulders. And then not long after that, the chiropractor recommended my mom get me into yoga. So from the age of 13, I was there because I was a very disciplined little kid. I was there listening, I think her name was Dixie Carter, and watching this and doing this routine with Dixie Carter morning and night to help me relax my shoulders. Okay.
And then skip ahead to like 1920. Around that time, I said I was having the spiritual awakenings.
19-20 years old.
I was 19, 20 years old. So this is back in like 2001. I moved out to Vancouver to attend my first year at the University of British Columbia. And I picked up the yoga then. Yeah. So I was doing some Kundalini classes. I was starting to broaden my horizons. There was something called, it still is very trendy, but some of these yoga trends are getting some backlash, but something called Bikram's yoga. And it's like, yoga. And if I'm honest, I remember back then thinking that yoga was just like dance. It was just like a fitness thing, and you're there in the Bikrams and you're sweaty.
Purely physical.
Yeah, purely physical. And I sort of renounced or denied anything else until another sort of 5-6 years later, I was pursuing an acting career after graduating from the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts. Yeah. And I mean, it just is what it was. I was partying too much. I lacked discipline, and I really didn't feel passionately about acting anymore. And legit, it was one of those sort of filmic moments of like being on my knees, being like, what am I meant to do with my life? Like that, this is awful.
Not at all dramatic.
It was very dramatic, Benjamin, very dramatic. But I legit like had that moment, and then the next day I was like stretching in my local gymnasium in Liverpool, and a yoga teacher from India walked in and said, your body would be very good for yoga. And that was my Mohan. And I trained with Mohan for a couple of years. I ended up going to India, and I just stopped acting. I let it go completely. And it was like all of these doors opened, because even at that time, yoga still wasn't really that popular. And so I was being asked to teach yoga like quite quickly after I started training, essentially. And I must say, like, in a very miraculous way, it's because of yoga that I'm in Devon. It's like because of yoga, really, that I've met yourself and all these amazing people. So, yeah.
How do people practice yoga at home? Because you can go along to a class and, you know, it's easy to follow because everyone's doing it, but it can be quite more difficult. I mean, you probably know what you're doing, but for the average lay person, any tips for kind of maintaining a practice at home?
The one just such a beautiful thing about yoga is like you don't need anything or anyone, because so the word yoga means like to sort of yoke the connection to spirit. That's how I kind of look at it. Or like, it's a part of us, like we all have this part of us that's like a divine spark of life. And the practice of yoga, whether we're like moving our bodies around consciously or we're just like really being aware, being present, paying attention. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? Like in its essence, that's the practice of yoga. But then most of us, what we see about yoga is the movement, right? All the poses. And like straight up legit, even if you're just doing yoga posing, your body and mind will gain benefit because biomechanically, especially, okay, this is a thing, is that so many people nowadays, we wake up, put the TV on, we get in our car, we drive to the office, we sit in the office, and then we get, am I right? There's a lot of people.
There's a French saying for that, can't remember what it is, but yeah.
There's a thing, like that's like the rat race, people call it, right? And so what we're finding is that lifestyle really is not great for our bodies. And I have a lot of clients that have that lifestyle, right? But they're getting to a certain age and they're having back problems, they're having ankle problems, they're having any number of little issues that are like, oh, I probably need to make some change. And yoga is often prescribed by doctors, physiotherapists, and all that kind of stuff. Because if you implement a regular yoga practice, so real basic function of like looking after your body from a yogic perspective is to just move your spine. So let's try it together. So if you just like sit up straight, and any of us could do this, like sitting in our office chair, right? Okay, so think of like, all I want to do is move my spine in all the directions it can go in. So we could move forward, and you get like a little stretch. Even if you stretch your legs out, you'd be like, oh my gosh, I can feel my back, I can feel my hamstrings. So that's forward. But then we'd also have to go back. So maybe we could stand up for this and just like stand up. If you put your hands behind you and then press your hips forward.
Right, here we go.
And then you can feel that, right? Like breathing. So breathing is a big part. If you're not breathing, there's an issue, right? So then we did back and forward, right? And then what's the other directions? Let's go. We can do sideways. Okay, so let's do our classic. Benjamin has done yoga with me, so he's a bit of an expert too. So reach up.
Into a acting breathing.
Yes, stretch, and then you stretch to the side, right? So like big stretch, you feel it down your side body, you're breathing into it, and then you can go the other way. How does Shazam? Here we go. How does Shazam? Okay, so then what did we do? We did front, back, and we did a side to side, and then finally a twist. So let's sit back down for the twist. I often like to make it just as easy as possible for people, because like even people can, it'd be hard to stand up. So now we're just going to twist. So see this, I'm going to put one hand on one leg, and then the other hand you're going to put on the bench behind you.
Practicing this at home.
You could. I mean, it's very safe. So then just look back behind you, use that hand to kind of press into your knee. You feel the twist, right?
Yep.
And as long as you're just breathing deeply, you literally really cannot hurt yourself. And then come my way as well. Right. Because we have to do all the directions. Oh, did you hear that? My spine just gave a little crack.
I can see sheep.
I can see sheep as well. And trees. Okay. And then, so honest, and I know we might be a bit biased, but like just from doing that spinal movement, do you feel any different?
I feel great. I was feeling a bit stuck. I didn't know whether I could move this way or that way, and now I feel a little bit more comfortable.
A little bit more awake, a little bit more aware. So that's the basic. So yoga just like has many, many, many physical benefit, but then via the way you practice with mindfulness and conscious breathing, that's how yoga tends to permeate our lives. Like we just feel better, make more conscious choices, and then, it's sort of exponential at that level.
So exponential means it gets
better and better. Yeah, you kind of become more self-aware. Not to say like there aren't continuous, like sometimes I always want to remind people like there's still challenges in life. You're not like floating on clouds or anything, but you do, it would appear like, typically by some people's narrative, like you start to degenerate and get worse off. For me and from my yoga community, I see people becoming more vital, more flexible, more capable into old age. And so there's a lot of that stuff that I think yoga is very powerful at transforming people's lives.
So thank you for that, MJ.
Thank you.
Now you've got a website, and there are different things on your website. One of those is a book that you wrote quite recently called The Fearless Life Guide.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Okay, so the Fearless Life Guide, I mentioned my early spiritual awakenings, or did I? Yeah. And all my research, so these sort of past 20 years, I've been quite obviously heavy into the yoga. And alongside the yoga, I studied a fair amount of metaphysics, different world philosophies, or world religions rather, and yeah, philosophical standpoints. And simply based on my own journey and help from other people, and after many years of blogging and sort of writing for different well-being websites, and as if I'm being really honest, just a way to expand the brand and expand the work that I'm doing, I published this book, The Fearless Life Guide, and it really is just my own interpretation of all these different sort of healing modalities and areas of scientific research and, you know, where we are as a humanity, my own personal transformational journey as well. And then like little lessons and bonus lessons that are like breath exercises or like the things I just shared with you, like simple things that help people look after themselves that aren't necessarily like socially propagated. Like we don't learn about emotional intelligence and emotional well-being at school. And yet in my adulthood, I've recognized that that's our emotional mental well-being is like a huge important part of our total well-being. And it is something that I sometimes see lacking in our kind of mainstream conventional society.
So one of the ways in which you help people is they will find the book. One of the other ways is that you coach people online. You've spoken about clients around the world. How do you help those people?
You know, I would like to reflect as well. Like, it is such an exchange, because one thing I'm increasingly aware of is like these people are showing up. So like, and really from a kind of spiritual perspective, all I often do is like hold space for people to share what's going on in their lives. Yeah, just share, like possibly in an environment or in a non-judgmental space that they couldn't find otherwise for whatever reason. And then the efficacy of yoga is that
efficacy.
So the like
how it works,
how well it works. Mm-hmm. So the word efficient, it's like how efficient it is. So then when you kind of open people up, and then you can offer them the tools like meditation, like yoga, right? Some people, and depending on their budget, being straight, like they might just meet once a week and be wanting to implement that once a week. And then just through that, committing to that once a week, they might naturally start. And I would encourage them to do maybe a few minutes more every day as well. Some people, they just dive in depending on where they are in their lives, and they're wanting to have like you know, 5 days a week, like we're on our yoga, we're meditating, we're moving, we're yogaing, and we're tuning in. So I support people with that. And yet increasingly as I navigate this work, I really realize, Benji, that like all this transformation is an inside job.
Okay.
So when you support people in transforming their lives, like that's all you, like it's a wonderful thing, but that's all I'm doing is permissioning those people to make change. Because sometimes when we make change, our family, our friends, our coworkers, they might not necessarily want us to. Or they might say, no, don't do it. Or actually, that's a security. You need that job. Or, right? And I'm somebody increasingly that says, no, like, you have one life. You might as well live it. And, yeah. So people then transform themselves.
Beautiful. If someone is going after their dreams, what can they do to make sure that they're living sort of in harmony with nature and not having a negative ecological footprint?
Well, that would require, in the first instance, you know, a level of awareness for sure. Once people become aware of it, one of the other courses I talk about and worked with another woman on was called the Zenful Zero Waste. And this is very much...
Zenful Zero Waste. Yes. Okay, quite a mouthful.
Well, because sometimes I think when you start to look at some of the information about, say, climate change or, some of the environmental issues that we're facing as a humanity, personally, I just feel is a direct connection to how much we are consuming blindly. Just buying stuff, like eating whenever and all that. So in the first instance, I think
I've never seen you eat, by the way.
Yes, you have. You absolutely have eaten chocolate with Philly, with your wife, and yeah. For sure, I am a vegan though. So but I'm somebody who's like a non-radical. I just say sort of like, you try these things. So the reason it's called Zenful Zero Waste is that a lot of people, I find, myself included, when you start to sort of pull on a thread and you see like, I don't know if you've seen any of those crazy photos of like the plastic islands that are floating in our oceans, right? And you're like, oh my God. And that is that plastic is the stuff that we buy on a conveyor belt blindly. So like initially I think it's going, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like there's a connection, right? Mm-hmm. But the reason I call it Zenful is that it's not worth compromising your emotional well-being. Because, man, like, we're all in it, right? We're buying what we're buying. However, I think even this, Benji, like, even our ability to have a conversation that maybe as a generation or people, we could, like, make a few changes, right? Maybe we could consume less. And I don't know about you, but, like, living more in nature and, like, you know, hanging out with people you love and feeling good in your body and, like, being able to eat the food that the nature provides, like, there is seriously awesome reward that comes from that makes you genuinely not care about having lots of stuff. Do you get that? So it's suddenly not like a race. Like I don't diss on it. Like if people want all the fancy cars and jewelry and
kind
stuff.
Of going for experiences more than like consumables.
For sure. Mm-hmm. Especially again when you look at the state of the oceans or you look at some of the like trash piles that we're creating, you think like, oh, maybe we could do better.
Well, look, it's been absolutely fascinating speaking with you, and I'm sure lots of our viewers will enjoy checking out your YouTube resources more. So that's All to Love TV, and we'll put a link under the video for that. But thank you very much for coming to talking to us today. It's been educational and fun, and yeah, thank you very much, MJ.
Thank you, Benjamin.